One of the most popular and certainly most infamous characters the Dark Angels have, and one who has always struggled a bit to find his place in terms of having good rules and a reason to bring him on the tabletop, especially when you compared him previously to the other useful leaders the Dark Angels had, like Azrael, Ezekiel, and even Samael, is the arguably meanest chaplain in the entire Imperium, the much feared Asmodai, the Master of Repentance. And so whilst he struggled before, in the new book he actually has a few things going for him. He's got a bit of an updated datasheet, and he can actually bring some somewhat nice buffs to some useful units now, because with his new great model, he can actually join some of the Primaris units now, like the Intercessors, the Assault Intercessors, and the Inner Circle Companions. Now, Asmodai sits quite pretty on a fairly cheap 70-point price tag, which is actually rather good for a Marine leader. However, he is somewhat fragile compared to other HQ options. He's only got toughness 4 and 4 wounds, and he only has a 3-up save and a 4-up invuln. So whilst in units he is definitely a bit more durable, against any dedicated precision shooting or melee, he can fall very, very quickly. And just to showcase that, a simple 3-man eliminator squad with bolt sniper rifles will, on average, if they stay still, have around an 80% chance of getting a wound through onto him, which is flat 3 damage, so they can almost kill him outright in one turn if they get lucky or they use a few rerolls. And they are only 75 points themselves, so he is definitely a bit squishy. And I would say that is arguably his major downside. But considering his cheap cost, I think he can actually be quite a good force multiplier for a unit that he joins. On his own, in terms of his own damage output, he has a Crozius Arcanum and a power weapon, and very kindly, GW have given him both a strike and a sweep profile, so he can swing with either 5 strength 6 minus 2 AP 2 damage attacks, or 8 strength 5 minus 2 AP 1 damage attacks, both hitting on 2s. And again, for his cost, that's honestly not awful. He can by himself kill a good 2 or 3 Marines or 5 or 6 Guardsmen, depending on which profile you use, so he definitely does add a little bit of oomph to a squad that he joins. The somewhat sad thing about his new datasheet is that he has lost his Blades of Reason, which I presume have been folded into the main profile as the power weapon, but I do think overall it's a bit of a disappointment because they were always fun. Like, they never did much in games, but they were always fun, and I think he would arguably maybe be worth bringing a little bit more if his weapons had something like lethal hits, just to show how he was also using his torture equipment to really hurt the enemy, no matter how tough they are. But in general, just on his own, he's not a super killy character, but he can add some punch in combat, and I think for his cost he does do a decent amount. He does of course have Oath of Moment for those key rerolls, and he also has the Deathwing keyword, which means he brings that buff to his squad, and as we'll see in just a little bit, that can be quite key. But in terms of his own innate abilities, he's got a couple. Feared Interrogator lets him choose an enemy character unit at the start of the fight phase, and they have to take a Battle Shock test at -1. Now, as always, Battle Shock isn't amazing, but having the -1 on top of that does make it a bit more reliable that they could fail it, and that could mean the difference between them getting a strat off on them when they need it the most, so it could be clutch in the right situation. But on top of that, the rule also states that when he destroys an enemy character, you gain a command point. Now this is nice, but the caveat is that it has to be Asmodai that kills the character, so if you put all of your attacks in, the enemy could potentially make those saves against Asmodai's attacks first and just survive it, or they could just put them all from the unit and just have the character die before Asmodai's attacks go through. If they know their character is going to die anyway, they may as well just take it on the attacks from Asmodai's squad, and then you won't get that bonus command point. So it is something to keep in mind that although it's a nice rule, it may not actually go off all that often because your opponent can counterplay it quite easily. Exemplar of Hate is probably his best rule, and this can make him a really solid beat stick. This allows him to let a unit that he has joined re-roll their hits in melee. and this is a very, very solid buff, especially if you have oathed another target that turn. This basically lets you join him to a melee unit, and they can really put out a lot of pain. And in terms of what he can join, he can jump alongside Blade Guard veterans, Inner Circle champions, Assault Intercessors. He can also join shootier units like Hellblasters or Stern Guard or regular Intercessors, but because he is such a melee-focused leader, I would say 99% of the time you are going to be joining one of the three of Assault Intercessors, Companions, or Blade Guard. And he is good in all three, especially thanks to bringing along those crucial rerolls. Blade Guard, of course, get that 4-up invuln to help keep them around, so they can be quite a durable unit. Bringing 6 of them alongside Asmodai with their tasty 2 damage power swords can be putting 7 wounds into a marine profile, so with 2 damage they can be killing off nearly a whole 10-man squad in one go, and then with Asmodai's attacks on top, they likely will do. They also quite nicely always get to use the Shields of the Chapter part of their rule because they are getting the rerolls to hit from Asmodai anyway, so it can make them that little bit more tanky with the 4-up invuln and rerolling ones. But with their new price drop, I think the Inner Circle Companions are now actually a potentially interesting prospect. Whereas before, at 105 points, they were just flat out worse than the Blade Guard, now they are the same 90 points. They do have some pros and cons. They do, of course, trade that 4-up invuln, so they are a bit less durable overall. But on the actual output front, if you use the strike profile for the Companions into 2 wound marine profiles, they are slightly better. They get +1 to hit when they are joined by a character from their rule Enmity of the Unworthy, but they do still suffer from that -1 AP. So compared to the Blade Guards, they can be hitting on 2s, and then of course having lethal hits does help, but it means that you could be getting around 9 or so dead marines from this unit compared to the Blade Guard, so they are a little bit better. And of course this does mean they are slightly better into things like vehicles and other really tough units thanks to those auto wounds. But where they really can find a place is against enemy hordes and bigger squads, because their sweep profile grants you sustained hits too. And now this can be really, really good with Asmodai because you're going to be hitting on 2s and you can reroll. So you could potentially reroll everything quite reliably. And if you do that, you can be getting around 38 hits from a unit of 6. And at strength 6, even against those new flavour of the month Orc boys in the Green Tide with that 5-up invuln and rerolling 1s, you will be wounding them on 3s, and you end up killing around 15 of them. So again, with Asmodai's attacks on top, you could easily wipe out a 20-strong blob of Orc boys thanks to these new buffs. In terms of their durability, whilst I'd say the 4-up invuln they lose from the Blade Guard is a big hit, they do get -1 to be hit thanks to their Braziers of Judgment, which is a nice bonus. As I said, it's not as good as a 4-up invuln, but it does help. It will keep you alive at range and in melee, and if your battlefield has a lot of cover, these guys could be relatively well protected and get up safely into the enemy and into melee. I do think that despite that -1 AP, which is a big downside on them, they are now a legitimate option. And if you know for sure you are up against armies with a lot of 1 wound units or armies with poor armor saves, then these guys could well be a better pick than the Blade Guard. If you know you are going up against a load of guardsmen or boys or gaunts or anything like that, these guys I think are going to come in handy more than a unit of Blade Guard would. Finally, we have the cheapest option to go with Asmodai, which is the Assault Intercessors. Adding Asmodai to them comes to a total of 220 points for 11 models, which isn't too shabby. And whilst they do have the weakest weapon profiles overall thanks to their chainswords, which are strength 4, -1 AP and 1 damage, they do get a little bit of extra bonus because the Sergeant can add some punch in the form of a Power Fist or Thunderhammer, and then they also get a very strong rule in Shock Assault, which allows them to re-roll wound rolls of 1, or if they are fighting near an objective, full re-rolls to wound. So now 10 Assault Intercessors with Asmodai completely base can be throwing out 40 strength 4, -1 AP, 1 damage attacks, and re-rolling all of their hits and all of their wounds, which is quite a scary prospect. It actually ends up doing similar to the other 2 units, putting around 13 wounds into a marine profile, so killing around 6 or 7, or also doing a fairly good job into chaff, getting you about 13 or so toughness 5 orc boys dead when you are fighting them near an objective. So all can be viable. If you want to go for the absolute cheapest, Assault Intercessors are there. If you know you're going up against hordes, maybe go for the companions. If you just want that more durability, more all-rounder and more anti-marine profile, then maybe Blade Guard would be the best option for you. But where Asmodai gets even more use is in that previously mentioned Deathwing keyword, because in the new Dark Angels Inner Circle Task Force detachment, the rule for that is that Deathwing infantry get +1 to wound against targets near to your vowed objective, and your vowed objective is an objective that you choose in your command phase, and you basically get a buff in the wound roll against enemy units near it. So what is key about this is that Asmodai has the Deathwing keyword, and that carries over to his unit. So now all of those melee units will also be getting +1 to wound against enemy units near your vowed objective, so you can be getting full rerolls to hit and then +1 to wound, and then of course for the Assault Intercessors, full rerolls to wound as well. And just in the case of the Assault Intercessors, that bump alone means that a squad of 10 alongside Asmodai can easily take out a gladiator tank with a few wounds to spare, or even into a really durable brick like Terminators. For just that 220 points, you can basically wipe out a full 5-man squad off an objective. You do something like 4.5, or you kill around 4.5 Terminators, so you can be very, very, very potent for your cost with all of these buffs stacking up. Obviously, one of the big issues is getting them there. All of these units, apart from maybe the Blade Guard, are quite fragile. The Inner Circle do have the -1 to be hit to help them, but I would say in terms of overall durability, if you want them to survive, the Blade Guard is going to be your best option. But I do think in general, Asmodai with one of these units can be run as a potentially unassuming but quite deadly little torpedo unit with one of these melee squads. He can quite reliably get up the board and unleash quite a lot of attacks, rerolling your hits and potentially rerolling your wounds and potentially getting +1 to wound. They can punch up quite well no matter which one you take. They are going to be great at taking out marines and hordes and even vehicles with quite good effectiveness. So I mean, yes, whilst I don't think he is quite as much of an auto pick as say Azrael is at the moment, or arguably even as useful in some ways as someone like Ezekiel, I think Asmodai has a lot of potential now that he can join those 3 melee units. And I think if you do want another cheaper melee threat, or you want to bring Azrael but he's already busy with some Hellblasters, this can be quite a deadly little combo for a reasonable amount of points that you can put on the board, and your opponent might not realize just how much damage they can do until it's too late. And that is Asmodai. I do quite like him. I think he's got a cool new model, and I think he is potentially worth at least trying out in an Inner Circle task force. But as always, what do you make of him? And has he made an appearance in any of your lists in 10th edition so far? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later, guys.